And now I have the privilege of introducing this morning's speaker. 13 years ago, Foster-Foreman was an undergraduate journalism major here at Penn State. He got his bachelor's in 2001, and after earning a master's degree in international relations from Columbia University, he returned to his native India to practice journalism. In a little over a decade, he has created a record of excellence that reflects great honor on his alma mater. The writing sample you received this morning and have in front of you illustrates his skill. He was assigned to profile an Indian press baron who refused to sit for an interview. In fact, he's never been interviewed by any reporter. Samith sketches a revealing portrait, nonetheless, which is based on probing interviews he did with people who knew and know the baron well. A lesser writer might simply tell us that the baron is a self-centered person. But Samith shows us through insightful anecdotes. Baron boorishly insists that any employee, no matter how senior, must take notes when in conversation with him. In addition to giving us glimpses of the baron's personality, Samith lucidly outlines the ethical issues swirling around his publication, revealing widely held suspicions that the news columns are available for purchase. In recognition of the quality of his journalism, Samith contributes regularly to leading publications and websites around the world, including some of the most prestigious in the United States, such as the New Yorker, the New York Times, the New Republic, Huffington Post. He's also widely published in his home country and in the Middle East, where he is the India correspondent for The National. He has also published a well-received nonfiction book in his home country. Now, this morning, I'll first ask Samith to come to the podium and read from his work and talk briefly with you about journalism. And then he will be joined on stage by Professor Russell Frank, who was one of Samith's teachers when he was an undergraduate here and was his academic advisor. They'll engage in a brief conversation, and then with Professor Frank moderating, we'll go to the audience for your questions. So please have them ready. Come to the standing microphones here and ask your questions. And now it's my great honor to welcome Samith back home, Penn State.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you, Gene, for your introduction. It's great to be back. It's the first time I'm coming back since I graduated in 2001, so I feel a little bit like a fraud coming here and standing and talking to you guys. I picked this particular excerpt that you have in your handout for a couple of reasons. The first is because I thought, we're all journalism geeks over here, and so we'd be interested in learning about a guy who built an Indian newspaper into the world's largest English language newspaper. This has a daily readership of around 7 million people. It has a circulation of around 3 million people. And so, the way in which he built this newspaper was really the focus of my profile. But the second is also for sort of technical writerly reasons, which is based, as Gene said, what do you do when you don't have access to the person who you want to profile? What do you do for color? Because I couldn't even observe Samir Jain at work. I couldn't get near him. I never met him. So what do you do for color? What do you do for scene and character? And so the opening part of this piece was an attempt to answer these questions and to figure out a way in which you can build a composite scene, talk to many people, ask them about what they saw and experienced, and build this scene out of that. So I'm just going to read for a little bit, maybe for 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll go into a question and answer session. In the collective memory of Times of India journalists, the notebooks loom large. No conversation about Samir Jain can be complete without mentioning them. If Jain, the Vice President of Bennett Coleman and Company Limited and publisher of the Times of India, invites you into his office for a chat, you're expected to carry a notebook and you're expected to take notes. We all had our Samir Jain notebooks, and anxious managers outside his cabin would hand us new ones in case we had forgotten ours, said an editor who worked at the newspaper during the 1990s. I even remember the type, Ajanta No. 3 notebooks, spiral bound in different colors. New initiates into Jain's meetings have made the mistake of decorating the pages of their notebooks with aimless doodles. Old hands learn at least to scroll down a few key words, lest they be quizzed the next day or the week after. It can be a chore. It can also be downright galling. After a cordial conversation in 1996, when Jain was still finding his feet around the paper, he pointedly told one editor, decades his senior, "It's so nice discussing these matters with you. But when others come to see me, they bring a notebook. Maybe you should too." In response, the editor told me, his voice still bearing embers of anger, I said, "You may own the paper, but this is not tolerable." Then I came downstairs and wrote out my resignation letter. Really diligent scribes can leave Jain's office with aching wrists. In large gatherings elsewhere, Jain prefers to remain a passive observer. But in these little conclaves, he can talk in mixed English and Hindi for an hour or more at a time. He is nothing if not discursive. His homilies have ranged over editorial matters, brand building and marketing, the nature of art, the psychology of his readers, sex, literature, and most commonly, religion and spirituality. Over the last 2.5 decades, Jain has imprinted himself indelibly onto the Times of India and thereby onto Indian journalism. In his newsroom, he is sometimes referred to discreetly as Supreme Being, and his will can be difficult to fathom. He preserves an Olympian detachment from his newspaper's coverage of politics, and editors attested to me that he never once calls to inquire about the next day's headlines, let alone to push a line in favor of one party or another. Simultaneously, though, Jain has been exacting and forceful in his mission to shape the Times of India, its editorial philosophy, its news priorities, its gimlet-eyed focus on the bottom line in his image. His demands can sound abstract or whimsical, and he is frequently elliptical about spelling them out, but he is insistent that they be met. Jain, who will be 59 in March, has a capacious memory, and he recollects nearly verbatim much of what he has read. The active Samir is a treat. He likes debate. If he argues with you on some point, it means he is willing to be convinced, said M.D. Nalapat, once a coordinating editor of the Times of India. Nalapat left the newspaper in the late 1990s, although he remains close to Jain. But total silence means deep disagreement, and there's no convincing him. If you're smart, you'll shut it down and not go any further. Jain is always polite and soft-spoken, but he watches his audience keenly. A former Economic Times editor told me, his eyes constantly flit around the room, and just when you think he isn't looking at you, you'll find that he is to see if you're listening. It's very unsettling. Strict rules of engagement govern Jain's meetings, some of them even written out explicitly as instructions from Bennett Coleman's management and distributed to new editors. You aren't supposed to look at your watch, for instance, said Vidya Subramanian, a former staffer on the editorial page, now an associate editor at The Hindu. Even if you have an appointment with the Prime Minister, that is secondary. No crosstalk is allowed. You don't scrape your chair along the ground, and you accord Jain rapt attention. In Behind the Times, a frothy cinnamon-dusted history of the newspaper, Bachi Karkaria, one of its columnists, describes a discussion in Jain's Mumbai office during which an editor had slumped a few degrees too many in her chair. Jain slid a folded slip of paper to her across the desk. In his spidery handwriting, it read, very discreetly, and without seeming to be reacting to this note, please do not sit with your knees pressed against the edge of the table. These assemblies have been pleasant for some. One former editor said that Jain was one of the best teachers I ever had. Talking to him focused your mind. It made you think through your position about something. For most participants, they were harrowing, like a subtle but perpetual test of obedience. He never directly dictated the edit line. He engaged you in long conversations, and you had to read between the lines, absorb the message, come back down and write your edit, Subramaniam said. One editor quit the paper because a constant effort to glean Jain's meaning grew too wearing. I'd come out of some of these sessions just ashen-faced, he said. I was rattled. I couldn't handle that intensity. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. From these offices, Jan administers the Bennett Coleman Empire, India's largest media house. In the year ending March 2011, converting to American dollars, Bennett Coleman earned revenues of $765 million and an after-tax profit of $157 million. By comparison, HT Media, which owns the Hindustan Times, registered revenues of $292 million, and Network 18 Media and Investments, which owns CNN, IBN, and CNBC TV 18, earned $239 million. Bennett Coleman, a private limited company, owns some stray real estate firms and brokerage houses, produces movies and music, dabbles in web commerce via India Times, and runs a mysterious subsidiary, Times Yoga Limited, whose purpose and nature I was never entirely able to establish. But almost all of Bennett Coleman's money is earned by its newspapers, the Times of India, the Economic Times, Navbharat Times, sundry city tabloids, and to a lesser extent by its television channels, such as Times Now and ET Now, a sheaf of magazines, and FM radio stations. In 2010-11, Bennett Coleman's dailies commanded 54% of the English language market in India's 8 biggest cities. The Economic Times, with a daily readership of more than 800,000, is India's biggest business newspaper. The Times of India is the country's highest circulated English language newspaper and also the highest circulated English language newspaper in the world, with a daily run of over 3 million copies. Its readership is nearly double that of its nearest rival, the Hindustan Times, and its sheer dominance in India, a country with more than 11,000 English newspapers and periodicals, is something of a marvel. There are now 50 editions across 40 cities. The Times of India has localized itself across the country in a way no newspaper has ever done before. Having long neglected his Hindi and Marathi dailies, Jain is also throwing himself afresh into the vernacular space, that is, newspapers published in the local languages. A few weeks ago, Bennett Coleman launched A Shomoy, a Bengali daily to compete with the venerable Anand Bazar Patrika. I think Sameer regrets not having spotted the growth of vernacular newspapers, the head of competing media house told me. We saw it 8 years ago, and we were surprised, frankly, that he didn't. We were always waiting for him to catch up. Playing catch-up is not Jain's style. There is little in the Indian newspaper business over the last 20 years that he has not pioneered. He has touched off explosions in circulations by pushing into new towns and into new reader segments, helping India become the world's largest English language newspaper market. He spotted before any of his peers the necessity of burnishing a brand, and his single greatest accomplishment lies in making the Times of India the country's foremost media brand. He has, with his cash reserves, kept newspaper prices ruinously low. A weekly issue of the Times of India costs 4.5 rupees, or 8.3 cents in New Delhi. This forces publishers to wring every possible rupee out of advertisers, and at this blood sport, Bennett Coleman has proven the most proficient. Separately, and well before other newspapers, the Times of India became adept at celebrity journalism, filling its supplements with movie star gossip and cocktail party photos and other exalted banalities. I think I'll stop reading here and maybe ask Russell to come up. Thank you for letting me lead.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear me. I want to begin with a letter that I wrote in 2001. To whom it may concern, Saman Subramanian is simply the most talented writer I have taught in the 3 years I have been a member of the journalism faculty in Penn State's College of Communications. His work in the feature writing class I taught in spring 2001 was polished and professional, clear and complete. It showed an ear for a good turn of phrase, an eye for the telling detail, and a feel for gathering information and presenting it to best advantage. Where other students in the class would come to my office for extensive one-on-one editing sessions on stories that needed additional reporting and extensive rewriting, Saman's visits were always brief. His rough drafts typically required only the slightest bit of fine-tuning. A story he did on the Americanization of Italian cuisine could run almost as is on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. In fact, if he chooses to pursue a newspaper career, I would not be surprised if he made it to the Journal or the New York Times in 5 years. He's that good. I would be happy to discuss his qualifications in further detail, best wishes, etc. So this makes me kind of feel like the scout who watched Derek Jeter play at the University of Michigan and said, this guy's going to be a Hall of Famer. So I was a little bit off. I said 5 years at the New York Times. Instead, it took him 10 years to get to the New Yorker. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get published in the New Yorker? Some of us, I won't say who in this room, have been trying for several decades. So tell us, trace your path, like how you got from here, from marching in commencement in spring 2001 to where you are now.
Well, I mean, the logistics of it was such that I finished school here in 2001 and I went back to India. At the time, I thought I wanted to be a sports journalist. I thought I wanted to cover cricket. And I did that. I did that for 2 years. And then I realized that working at covering cricket was killing my love for the game a little bit, and so I quit. And for the next 3 years, I became a freelancer and I did a little writing. And then I went to get my master's in political science, went back to India and sort of worked for newspapers there and magazines there. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts of the career since Penn State. But at sort of a more thematic level, I guess it took me time to figure out what I wanted to do in the journalism field. And I think I found at some point, maybe 4 years after I graduated, that I loved this genre that they call narrative journalism or literary journalism or long-form journalism. I loved the time that it gave me to think about a subject and to read and talk to people and then to craft a story that could, conceivably stand as sort of the definitive word on something. And so I edged my way closer and closer to that, to the point where finally I started writing these sort of 5,000 and 8,000 and 10,000 word stories.
I was thinking, I read Samad's book last year, and I was hoping to be able to hold up the book and show it to you, but then I realized that I read it on my Kindle. So, but here it is, Following Fish. I highly recommend it. The piece that you just read from, I'm always interested in reading the reader comments, the reader responses to a piece of journalism. So I want to just read a couple of the comments and then ask them a question about this.
Sure.
A couple of them were, thank you for this well-researched and collated article about a man who was so hard to reach and learn from. Another one said, another reason why Samad Subramanian is by far the best feature-writing journalist in the country. Kudos for the excellent researched article. But then there were comments like this. 16,000 words of utter trash and tripe. The writer is an ignoramus who knows nothing about Samir Jain. I'm even more surprised if he deserves such a lengthy and lazily written article. How do you handle negative comments?
Well, I think rule number one of journalism in this day and age has always been don't look at reader comments on websites. They are not sort of the best representation of humanity by and large. But there's sort of a deeper question about how you handle negative criticism. And look, this is the nature of the game, right? You're basically putting yourself out there, putting something that you've written, that you've worked on, and it is going to be subject to scrutiny and criticism. So, by and large, I try to think about whether the article or the book or whatever, reflects accurately what I found, and whether people who know the subject as well as I do, or better than I do, think that it's an accurate representation. After the piece came out on Samir Jain, I never met Samir Jain, of course, but about a week after it came out, I met the CEO of the big media company. And I said, has Samir read the piece? And he said, oh, yes. In fact, he was the one who sent me a copy of the magazine. He said it was he said he was happy with it. It was very balanced. At that point, I decided that was all I needed. If he thinks that I didn't malign him or praise him too much, that was pretty much what I was looking for.
Start to get ready with your questions, but let me ask one or two more. Could you tell us a little bit about the book that you have coming out this year? And also, I kind of promised my ethics students that I would ask an ethics question. So there's some ethics issues related to that book that you and I were talking about this morning.
Yes. Yeah, okay. So the book I have coming out, this is published in July in India, and then it will come out in the UK in February, and then hopefully later in the US next year. The book is sort of it's a narrative history of the last 50 years of Sri Lanka, which includes the 30-year war, the civil war that ended in 2009. And the idea was to basically, everything I read about Sri Lanka, this country that's so close to India, but still remained something of a mystery because everything that had been written about the war had been written from a top-down perspective. There were a lot of political books or sort of big picture history books, but there was nothing that was just about the people on the ground and how they lived their lives through this war. So I started researching the book in 2010. I moved there in 2011, and I spent almost a year there traveling and interviewing people, and it's finally coming out now. So the idea is basically to just talk to very regular people, and one of the ethical dilemmas that I mentioned to Russell earlier in the morning, I was in this town called Batticaloa, which is on the eastern coast of Sri Lanka, and I was talking to this guy who had been in he was a Muslim guy who had been praying in a mosque on a Friday evening in 1990 or 1991, I forget the year, and the militant group that has been that was driving the war basically came to the mosque and massacred nearly everybody in that mosque at the time. This guy escaped, although he still limps. He has shrapnel in his thigh. But he saw, for example, his 4-year-old cousin shot in front of his eyes. I mean, a gun was put into his mouth and the trigger was pulled. So I went to talk to him about sort of his memories of that evening. And we were sitting down and he said, I have no problems talking to you, and I've done this before with other journalists, but what do I get out of it? In all likelihood, I'm not going to see the book you write. It doesn't do anything for the pain in my thigh. It doesn't bring back the people I lost. And I had no answer for him. And it made me realize, all of journalism is just one big ethical dilemma. It's just, you always go to people and you tap their vulnerabilities and you tap their insecurities and their fears and their memories, and you take their time and energy and you use it for your articles and your books. But their lives at the end of it are not materially better off. And the only answer I gave him was a very weak one. I said, it's important that people know your story. And it is. That's true. It is important that people know his story, but he's going to continue to live his life exactly as he has for the last 20 years. And in this kind of case, when you think about these dilemmas, the only thing you can promise yourself again and again is to make sure that you tell their stories responsibly and accurately, and you portray them with a full sense of justice and fairness, and that's the most you can do. There's a great book out there called The Journalist and the Murderer by Janet Malcolm, and I highly recommend that you pick it up. But this is about a journalist who, she writes for New York. I think she's a staff writer there now. This is a book that basically just does this. It just explores this dilemma of being a journalist and what it means to prey upon people's stories and lives and use it for your work. So that's sort of, I guess the only resolution I came to for myself is that you have to just, the most you can do is be responsible and fair and hope that what you write does justice to what you found.
Now I'm going to keep my other questions in reserve in the hopes that I leave plenty of time for you all to ask questions. So we have microphones, one on each side. And, please come up and give us your best shot.
I remember being an undergrad, I never wanted to ask questions. It's the worst.
Nick.
Hello. Excuse me. My question is, how did being a Penn State student and getting your Penn State degree and everything you learned here help you in the professional world of journalism right outside college?
Yeah, I came to Penn State to start my journalism degree thinking that there's only probably so much that a journalism degree can teach you, and that by and large you need to have a certain innate grasp of the field and of the language to be able to do your work. And I was totally wrong, because the degree teaches you so much. It teaches you so the sort of nuts and bolts, the mechanics of journalism. It teaches you that so well that you don't need to think about that later when you go out and work. You can think about the bigger ideas, the themes, and how to make your story better and how to talk to other people. Everything else becomes second nature, and you can kind of just coast on that. The other part of the degree that I enjoyed was the fact that 50% of
the credits that you take have to come from non-journalism courses. And I think that's a huge boon. I think in a big university like this, with so many departments, it's just a great excuse to go out there and take classes on anything. I mean, I took classes on astrophysics and art history and Greek history, and I took skiing for credit. I mean, just all sorts of stuff that I would never have learned in a classroom otherwise. And it gives you the flexibility, and it gives you sort of a huge diversity in terms of a knowledge base to then go out there and be able to write about anything, or almost anything. I mean, you at least have some inkling of what you're thinking about and writing about when you research a story on a subject that is unfamiliar to you. So I think those are the two sort of big takeaways I think I got at Penn State.
Sir.
A few weeks ago, Bob Woodward was here, and he spoke of current events.
Mm-hmm.
And having read a lot of his stuff about 4 or 5 years ago, I realized that what had happened is he had become married to an opinion of how Obama ran his and continued to use the same and justify his new opinions based upon the fact that he had already put down in print the way he felt. Is that a problem for a journalist in book writing as opposed to, where everybody forgets what you wrote the day before in the paper?
That's a really good question, and you're completely right. I mean, that the Bob Woodward that we knew from Watergate is not the Bob Woodward who's operating today. I mean, there are questions raised about exactly the kind of things you pointed out. I mean, by and large, I think for a journalist, for a reporter, it's wise not to write too many opinion columns. I think that would just be sort of there's a reason why, even in the best newspapers, there's a reason why there's a wall between the editorial pages, which is where the opinion is laid out, and the rest of the pages where the reporters do their work. And the reporters very rarely cross over and write an op-ed and then go back to their day job. For somebody like Bob Woodward, of course, he's sort of a class of his own, and he can write whatever he wants. But you're completely right. I mean, you do get wedded to something you've put down in print. The best newspapers, the best journalists have this problem. The New Yorker refused to question America's reasoning for going into Iraq, for the Iraq War. It's a sort of a blot on its record. And it can't retroactively go back and kind of criticize itself. It's very difficult to do. And it's much harder to do for sort of a single journalist who has his reputation to think of. I mean, the way I always see out of this is basically to just, as I said, not write too many op-eds. I restrict them to maybe 2 a year and stick to reportage for the best part of it.
Other questions? There might be some people in this room who would like the idea that 10 years from now, let's say, there could be the ones standing at the podium reading from their work, being invited back to their alma mater. What advice do you have for them to get to where you are right now?
I mean, the two standard pieces of advice that are given to journalists and writers are just to write and to read. And those are important. And then when I was at Penn State, actually from Professor Foreman's class, I picked up another piece of advice, which is to rewrite. I remember him quoting Joan Didion and saying, Joan Didion said, "I don't write, I rewrite." That's a great piece of advice. But to that, I would like to add a fourth piece of advice, which is just to reread. Because a lot of the long pieces, the feature pieces, the books that we read them once, and it's all fresh, right? I mean, we're consuming them primarily for what is new, the novelty, what it's telling us. But we usually don't on the first read dissect the pieces that we admire. We don't kind of break it down for ourselves to figure out how a piece is doing what it's doing. And at some point, a few years ago, I found out that it was so useful to just, if I read a piece and I admired it, I would put it away for a little while, and then I would go back to it, and I would figure out what makes it tick. What is it inside? What is the mechanism that is giving it color and giving it sort of a narrative impetus? What is moving the story forward? And the more you learn, the more you teach yourself these kind of things, the more you can then implement them in your own work. I mean, that's the great thing about journalism, is that your textbook is out there every day in the world in the form of newspapers and magazines, and there's new textbooks being produced on a weekly basis. There's a new issue of the New Yorker out every week. So you can just kind of pick it up and look for new lessons in how to do what you do. I mean, it's a pretty unique field in that sense.
No questions. Dan's got
I'll ask a question.
John.
I thought the anecdote that you gave about going to Sri Lanka and interviewing the gentleman from the mosque was really interesting. In the question of how you make a case for people to talk to you. And this was someone who had willingly met you.
Mm-hmm.
When you do a story like you did on Samir Jain, and you have to talk to a lot of people around him and who know that he doesn't want to talk, can you elaborate for us on some of your techniques or some of the things that you do
Yeah.
to persuade people, especially reluctant sources, to talk to you?
Yeah, I mean, I find often that sources are reluctant only for one reason, is that they don't know if they can trust the journalist. It's not necessarily that there's sort of a blanket ban on talking to journalists, it's just that they don't know you, and so they don't know if they can trust you. So there's a couple of ways around this, and the one way is basically to just slog it out and work for a decade and write a lot until people know for the most part that you're a reliable journalist who doesn't sensationalize things. But the other way is to basically just use your contacts to get introductions to people. So there's an intermediary in the middle who's basically telling, I don't know, one of the former editors of the newspaper saying, look, I know this guy, you can trust him, just talk to him, you know, if you don't want to be quoted, you don't want to be, that's fine, but just at least have a conversation with him. The third way is to just go back to them again and again. I mean, you know, Dan, I'm sure you know this in the series that you wrote, is basically that people will trust you once they realize that you're in it for the long haul. That you're not just there, you know, talking to them for 10 minutes and getting the first impression of the first batch of quotes and then leaving. So you call them again and again, you meet with them as much as possible. This is not always practical because you can't do this for a newspaper story where you're pushing something out the next day. But what you can do, even if you're working a beat on a newspaper, is just to meet your contacts without an agenda. Because that's the only way they'll get to know you, and that's the only way they will know that they can trust you, that you are sort of a real person, a flesh and blood person, as opposed to a hack. That's what I found, I mean, by and large. I got lucky a little bit also because when you write about the media, I mean, and this is the case everywhere, the media is kind of very inward looking, so everybody knows everybody. So, for example, the former editors of the Times of India had probably read my byline, and they definitely knew the magazine that I was writing for, and they knew that the magazine was fairly upstanding and had a certain amount of integrity, and so I got lucky in that sense. But it's harder when you go out there into the real world, where there are people who may not necessarily know who you are or know your work.
Professor Dillon.
Okay, question. Interesting. I think it's interesting. You write for audiences in three very different parts of the world. Primary American audience, a very large Indian audience, and English speakers, maybe expats, plus lots of other internationals in the Middle East. So I was wondering if there are different expectations from those audience for journalists, either in terms of tone or voice or approach or other kinds of things that you have to think about when you're writing stories for those different audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in fact, it's a big problem with the Sri Lanka book in particular because it's being published in Sri Lanka, where, of course, everybody knows everything about the war. And then it, is also being published in India and then in the UK and hopefully in the US. And so there's like a spectrum of knowledge or ignorance about the war that you have to contend with. And you're completely right. It makes the writing process infinitely more difficult because you don't know what kind of knowledge to presume in your audience. I find that the best way is to just to figure out a way of telling a story that is engaging and entertaining to people in every single market, I guess. And to kind of, even the explication, the exposition that you have to lay down about Sri Lankan history, for example, do it in a way that would be interesting even to a Sri Lankan audience. So let me give you an example of this. It would have been easy for me to just very quickly sketch out the history of the war in very dry terms for an American audience, but that would have bored the pants off a Sri Lankan audience because they know everything about the history of the war already. So I had to figure out a way or a character who could carry the history for me. And I found this guy who was a Tamil, who was a minority, and the minorities were the ones who wanted a separate state, and they were the ones who were kind of fighting the war against the Sri Lankan government. So I found a Tamil who had signed up, who had enlisted in the Sri Lankan army long before the war began. So he was a minority in the majority, and he was basically fighting his own people. And this was a very weird situation for him, and he had a whole host of bizarre experiences. He finally quit the army because he realized that the army was doing untold damage to his people. He emigrated to Canada. Now, he was helpful in two ways. One, because he's a great guy, he's a fascinating character. But two, also I could just pin the entire history of the military strategy in the beginning of the war and how the war progressed in the 80s and the early 90s on his shoulders. And he could carry that for me. And so it becomes interesting for a Sri Lankan audience because they don't know this guy and he's a character. But then also simultaneously the British and the American readers who may not know much about the war, they learn about the war through his eyes. So you have to figure out sort of narrative techniques like this, I guess, and think about ways. And it's never easy, and you have to keep rethinking it. There's no sort of one-size-fits-all answer to this at all.
Just a follow-up, sort of to John's question. I'm curious, after your long piece on Samir Jain, whether you felt that whether you have any thoughts on whether the success that the Times of India has had in terms of circulation has lessons for newspapers in other parts of the world, or whether it's unique to the Indian market.
It has lessons. I don't know if they're necessarily good ones. Or positive ones. Samir used a range of cutthroat tactics. He had a lot of money, so for example, he could really drop the price of his newspaper. As I said, it's around 4.5 rupees. That's low even by Indian standards. It's less than a cup of tea in most places. And so for a newspaper, and obviously because he did that, his competitors had to do that to compete. And so none of the newspapers basically make money on their cover price at all. They have to depend so much on advertising that sometimes there's a certain compromise in integrity that comes with depending that much on advertisers. Samir has been accused, not unfairly, of dumbing down his content to make sure that it reaches the lowest common denominator, and so therefore he can sell more copies. So these are not necessarily lessons that I would advocate other newspapers should pick up. But there's a certain acuteness and a shrewdness that comes with his knowledge of the Indian market. He knows his reader so well. And he's always, in fact, a lot of things that he did, for example, the slashing his prices, he anticipated a lot of things that Rupert Murdoch did. So Rupert Murdoch cut his prices in the UK in the mid-90s, I believe, but Samir Jain did it a few years before that. Similarly, Murdoch sort of revamped the front page of his newspaper for shorter stories. Samir Jain did that a few years before Murdoch. So, a lot of these things have to do with the fact that you realize that your market is changing, that attention spans are dwindling, that people are looking for a certain kind of news, that very often a newspaper is later news because it's already been online for 12 hours the previous day, and so you have to figure out a way to make it fresh. These are things definitely that I think newspaper owners and publishers everywhere should learn, because this is the truth of the world we live in today. If something happens now, literally at 11 o'clock, the New York Times is only going to have it on its front page tomorrow at 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock. So there's 20 hours almost before the news comes out in a newspaper. And you have to figure out what to do with that space and how to make a story tomorrow, not read like wire copy right now. So these are lessons, I think. But these are universal lessons. He's cracked it to a certain extent. His website is still terrible, for example. So, he still has a lot of learning to do himself. But there are some there's a certain insight into his market that I think other newspaper owners would do well to replicate.
I think having you and Dan Gilbert on the same program is sort of a great pairing
because of the beards, right?
Yeah, as well as mine. He does sort of investigative journalism, and you do this sort of long-form kind of feature journalism, often written in the first person. And so neither of these kinds of journalism are the sort of daily beat coverage kinds of stories.
Yeah.
How is what you do like and unlike what he does, would you say?
I would say just in the time you invest in what you do. I mean, if you're an investigative reporter like Dan, I think it just takes a lot of time and energy to unearth the documents that you need and the cross-check and the verifications and the facts. And very often you have to kind of, as he was saying yesterday, file freedom of information requests and negotiate sort of the bureaucracy of the government. And that takes time to do, and it takes a lot of tenacity to do. Narrative journalism is not necessarily it's not necessarily like pulling teeth in a way that investigative journalism invariably is. But it still takes time and energy because you just need so much detail and anecdote. You need to know what to put in and what to leave out. You need to know how to be concise, which sounds weird from somebody who just wrote a 16,000 word piece. But the original piece was 24,000 words, and that was shrunk down to 16,000. So you need to know what to keep in and leave out. I mean, it's time, and time is the big sort of, is what separates us, I guess, from people who cover city council or do sort of a daily beat where they need to produce a story almost every day.
Yeah. Any question?
I was wondering, I've been tall enough for this. I was wondering what, on a day-to-day basis, what some challenges that you face to remain just and fair, and if you have a process to overcome them.
To remain just and fair?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, being just and fair is basically a question of talking to enough people from every angle that you can possibly think of. And there's always temptation when you've talked to 20 people for a story, for example, to think, yeah, that should be enough. And then you go out and talk to 10 more. The day-to-day challenge is basically finding the energy to go out and seek more sources. And you have to at some point develop a sense, obviously, of when enough is enough. And there's a great line there was some journalist who said, when you've done enough reporting, when you meet yourself coming in the opposite direction, when you go and meet a new source. And he said, yeah, I knew you were going to be here. And at that point, you know that that's enough, because everybody in that circle is already anticipating your story, and they know that you're doing this. But that's basically it. I mean, finding the energy to go out and do a little bit more reporting. You'll have sort of pages and pages of notes and thousands of words of tape recordings, and you look at all of that and you think, oh my God, it's so much. But a question of fairness is basically a question of just talking to more people and making sure you have every single angle covered. Thanks.
I was just going to weigh in very briefly on that question about what is similar and different about what we do. And I think that people come to the Wall Street Journal and people come to Caravan or the New Yorker or some of the other places you write for very different reasons. And I tend to write in 800 words or less often, and you do quite considerably more than that. Because when people read something that's long form, they're looking for something to enjoy the experience of reading as well, as opposed to just consuming information. So something that I have to think about, even when doing my shorter articles, are the attention spans of people and the different ways that people are reading and reading on their phones. And I'm just curious if that has influenced the way that you write and the length of the pieces you do, or the way that you think about holding a reader throughout 16,000 words.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. You mentioned this yesterday, in fact, is the fact that it's very easy for a reader to switch off, and it's very difficult to keep him or her reading. And it's in a way, I mean, I do 800 word stories as well all the time, and it wouldn't hurt me as much if a reader switched off from an 800 word story. But if they switched off from a 16,000 word story that took 9 months to do, it feels tragic almost in a way. And so you're right. I mean, there has to be a constant sense of story. I mean, story is the best way to describe what we do, right? This is what we do. We tell stories, and I constantly think of what I would just tell somebody if I was just telling him the story when he's sitting next to me. What is interesting about this guy? Why am I writing about this guy? And so the anecdotes that I would tell a friend who's sitting next to me across a bar table, or the anecdotes I would tell my mom about why I'm covering this guy, those are the anecdotes that would make sense to the average reader, and that would draw him or her into the story. And you write these kind of words, I mean, this kind of word length, you have to think about these things like character and narrative arcs, and it's almost like you're writing a film script. And you have to envision scenes where you can have color and people interacting with each other. It's almost novelistic in a way. It's fascinating and really difficult to do, but so engaging, so rewarding when it finally comes off, on the occasions that it comes off.
What is the difference between working in an international newsroom like in India as opposed to working like for the New York Times?
Much of it is what John said, is basically when you're writing a story about India for the New York Times, you have to figure out what your audience doesn't know. And sometimes that means, for example, having to write really potted descriptions of Indian history or Indian politics that are really boring to write in a way, because I mean, you know this living in India, you know, for example, what the Congress party is. This is the oldest political party in India, and you know that, its history and its tangled messes and who its big leaders were, and the readers know it. But you have to kind of provide a 1 or 2 line description of the party for an American readership. And sometimes those are kind of, you have to constantly find interesting ways to convey that information, which you don't ever have to do in India. I mean, people know what you know, and you can just get on with what you're actually saying. I think that would be the sort of the biggest challenge. You have a question?
As a journalist, I think one of the things I'm worst at is interviewing people. I'm constantly leaving an interview and thinking how stupid I sounded. So I guess I'm wondering, what are some interviewing tips, and how did you get good at perfecting that craft?
There are journalists out there who will tell you that sounding stupid is the best thing in an interview, because that's when the subject loosens up and starts explaining things from scratch, and that's what you really need. You don't want to go in there in a way sounding as sophisticated or more sophisticated than the person you're interviewing, because then he or she doesn't have any incentive to tell you everything. So and it's a good thing for a journalist to be stupid, because that means that you're basically at the same level as your reader, and that's the only way you're going to be able to explain this really complicated subject to your reader, because you know exactly what knowledge level they're operating at. So I wouldn't worry about it at all. I mean, I think that's a completely, it's an advantage. And ask the dumb questions, all the time, because you may find things that surprise you, you may find good quotes in there, you may find, new material, or you may actually figure out that even the things you thought you knew were wrong. Ask the dumb questions all the time, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's better you get it wrong in the interview than in the story.
Okay, so here's my last dumb question. In your book, Following Fish, you quote V.S. Nepal about wanting to be a discoverer of people, a finder of stories. How do you do that? How do you become a discoverer of people and a finder of stories?
It would be a little bit of a cop-out to say this, but I think in one way you have to just be naturally curious about the world around you, and just want to know about how it operates and about the people who run the world and run various aspects of it. And you have to be curious about stories, about people's stories and about their lives. This is very different from, for example, if you're an engineer or a scientist, these qualities are not necessarily the ones that are needed. I mean, you need curiosity anyway, but it's not this kind of human curiosity that marks us out. So that part of it, I guess, comes from within. But then a lot of it is just the ability to listen and the ability to just sit down and have somebody ramble on, or encourage them to ramble on, and make sure that, and if you're curious about their lives and curious about where they're from and what they do and who they are, that comes naturally again. And finally, it's just, a lot of it is just legwork and just going out there again and again, shoe leather reporting, they used to call it back in the day. Back in the day, I sound so old. Anyway, shoe leather reporting, they used to call it 6 years ago. Just the willingness to walk out and, find more people and just talk to them and, have a cup of tea with them or have a drink with them. And, it's great fun. I mean, every time I meet somebody new, I never want to talk about myself. I just want to hear about where they're from and, what they do and what it's like in their field of work. that's the joy in being a journalist.
So thanks for coming back to see us and making his old professors so proud.